Hi there. It's been quite a while since my last upload, partly because I haven't painted a whole lot over the last few years, and partly because I didn't feel like I had anything worth sharing. Well, with my recent foray into Age of Sigmar, I've been trying out some new techniques, and I've had a lot of folks asking for the paints I used in my yellow and black Cities of Sigmar scheme, so I felt this would be a good opportunity to walk through and explain not just the recipes, but also the underlying processes that are equally important to getting good results. Now, to set expectations, this is not about getting models on the table as quickly as possible like I did for my Blackout minis. At the same time, I won't be doing any painstaking layering and glazing work like on my previous ogres. For this project, I'm following the same ethos as I did on my Tyranids and Stormtroopers, focusing on techniques that look good on the tabletop. I'll be making heavy use of contrast style paints, but also incorporating traditional techniques to elevate them further. It's about getting the best ratio of effort to results, hence the straightforward, if uncreative, title of efficient painting. Enough preamble, let's jump into it. So today I'm going to be demonstrating on a Free Guild Grenadier. For models with shields, I like to paint the shields separately, but here it's all one piece, so I'll go straight into priming. I'm going to be making heavy use of contrast style paints for this scheme, so I'll start by airbrushing on a couple of light layers of Badger Stynylrez white primer. If you don't have an airbrush, that's fine, because Games Workshop's white scar goes on surprisingly smoothly for a rattle can primer. Still, I prefer the control afforded by the airbrush, and once I have at least partial coverage, I'll switch to Vallejo Model Air White. With this, I can build up a solid white, spraying until the surface just looks visibly wet, and then moving on. You might reasonably wonder why I'm not starting with gray and then doing a zenithal prime or white dry brush as in the slap chop method, and basically it comes down to those techniques producing a less saturated result, which is particularly noticeable with bright colors like yellow. I'm using pure white for maximum vibrancy, and I'll get the necessary shading through other means. Okay, now I have a good base coat, but since I'm going to be using contrast style paints, the finish matters a lot. Too matte a finish will create a chalky texture or no shading, while too glossy a finish will cause the paint to crack and otherwise behave suboptimally. So to even it out, I'm going to spray the Grenadier with Vallejo Satin Varnish thinned with water, and this should actually look wet so that it has enough volume to self-level. If you don't have an airbrush, then a rattle can satin varnish will also work fine, and I highly recommend not skipping this step as it's much harder to avoid the buildup that causes that glossy surface when priming with a rattle can. The model is now primed, but before applying any paint, I have to decide what colors to use. With these cities models being so visually busy, I like to take some time to figure out what the different parts of the sculpts are meant to represent. My interpretation of the basic uniform is that cities infantry have 3 layers of clothing. A basic shirt and pants, then a gambeson, which covers the torso and sleeves, and lastly an aventail cover or cloak depending on the sculpt. Since the gambeson collar is tricky to get out without getting paint on the cloak or helmet, I'll start with the yellow, and first I'll demonstrate what not to do. This is Vallejo Xpress Dreadnought Yellow right out of the bottle, and I'm applying it thinly as if it were conventional paint or going over a strong pre-shade. Since that didn't make for a strong yellow, I do it again, and lo and behold, it's still a fairly flat color. This is a waste of what Express paints are capable of, so I'll strip and reprime the mini. This time I'm using a 2-to-1 mix of Dreadnought Yellow to Express Medium, and rather than apply it thinly, I'm slopping it on and then wicking away the excess as it pools. Express paints have a very long drying time compared to contrast or speed paints, which means I can pull paint where it starts to pool and shift it around to where I need stronger coverage without tearing half-dried paint and totally screwing it up. Once that's dry, I'll do a second layer. You can see how even with the dilution, by applying it more heavily, I get a nice orange in the recesses, while the raised edges are visibly lighter. This is the effect I'll be going for with all the Express paints in this video. And just note that later steps are going to desaturate this a bit, so if you're trying this for yourself, it's important to get the color a little stronger than you want the final result to be. If you want a more lemony yellow for the end result, you can also just do one heavy coat of pure Dreadnought Yellow over white like on these gallants, or if you want a really rich, almost orange yellow, 2 coats of pure Dreadnought Yellow will work like on these Cavaliers. Alright, next is the black, but first I have to do a bit of cleanup using pure white. It pays to be careful with contrast style paints since having to reapply white is annoying, but some mistakes are inevitable and it's at least much easier to clean up areas that haven't been painted yet. From this point on I won't show the cleanup steps, so just assume that I'm cleaning up the area I'm about to paint with pure white as needed. I should also mention that while I try to work from the inside of the model outwards, I also prefer to work from dark colors to light, as the mistakes I make with light colors over darker ones will be much less obvious than the inverse. If that doesn't make sense yet, don't worry, I'll be demonstrating later. Anyways, for the black, I use Express Hospitaller Black diluted 1:1 with Express Medium. Even with the self-leveling properties of Express, it's tough to get a smooth result with one coat over white, so I prefer to thin it out and do 2 layers, again applied heavily and wicked away as needed. This might not read as black right now, and if you want it to be really dark, you could dilute the Hospitaller less, but it will get a bit darker later, and as long as it's the darkest part of the model, I find it still reads as black. I'll also do the boots now, following the same recipe, and really I should have done them with the cloak, I just forgot. So now, keeping with the principle of working inside to out, I'll do the flesh using Express Dwarf Skin. This is a fairly light tone, and if it doesn't accentuate the facial structure to the degree I'd like, I just go back in and add a bit more as needed. The face is the focal point of the model, and it's worth putting a little extra care and attention into. Now for metallics, and I'm going to start by base coating all the silver metallics with Vallejo Metal Color Chrome. The metal color line is primarily intended for airbrushing and very thin out of the bottle, and while most of them cover well, chrome does not. So I find with this paint it helps a lot to let it sit on my palette for a few minutes to thicken up just a little bit, and then it can cover in 2 coats. With that done, I have a few brass accents I'll pick out with metal color gold. On this model, that's just the clasp for the cloak and the buckle on the belt. On some models, I would also do the crest on the helmet, but with these grenadiers being regular infantry, I want them to feel a little more mundane and less ornate than the cavaliers or gallants. Time for the actual contrast work, and for this I use a 1:6 ratio of Hospitaller Black to Express Medium. I keep a pre-mixed bottle of this on hand, one of 2 pre-mixes I'll be using in this tutorial, and just like before I'll slop it onto all the metallics and then wick away excess. Again, it's important that the flat surfaces be darker than the edges, so it is best to err on the side of a heavy application and only police it where it pools excessively. Oh, and since I didn't drill out the barrel of the arquebus, I'll make sure to add a sizable bead of black in the middle of the barrel to give the impression of some depth. I really should have drilled them all out, but it just slipped my mind. So it goes. The 2 major remaining materials are leather and wood, and this is another area that warrants some observation and planning. In the real world, leather and wood occupy a very similar spectrum of colors, from buff or tan to orange-brown to dark brown all the way to black. That means on a model with both materials, it's best to pick significantly different colors for them. The issue here is that I've already used black as a main uniform color, but I also have this orangey yellow. Those limit my options somewhat. So I'll go with a dark brown for the leather, but a birch or pale oak for the wood. Like I said before, I prefer to go dark to light, so leather first, and for this I'll use Express Willow Bark. Because it's so dark, it would go on smoother if I were to dilute with medium and apply 2 coats, but I don't bother for 2 reasons. The first is that there are no large flat areas of leather on these sculpts where unevenness would be really noticeable, and the second is that I find a little bit of unevenness, while not particularly realistic at the scale of these miniatures, does give it an organic look that helps sell the leather effect. So that's 1 heavy coat of willow bark, again slopping it on and removing excess as needed. And you might be thinking, hey, if you're doing brown leather, why'd you paint the boots in black? It's pretty simple really, it keeps the boots from blending in with the leather gaiters, breaking up what would otherwise be solid blocks of brown below the knee. As with metallics, you can be as arbitrary as you like about assigning colors, so long as it makes sense for the materials. So for the wood, I'll use Express Bag of Bones. Because this color is so light, it won't do a whole lot on the first pass, which means while I'll need a second coat, also means that any minor mistakes that get on prior colors will likely be invisible. That's the main reason for going dark to light as mentioned earlier, it just reduces the amount of cleanup needed now that any mistakes will first require blocking in white and then trying to blend it in with the appropriate Express color. For this wood, I am again making sure I apply it heavily because I want this to accentuate the wood grain present in these sculpts. There's unfortunately something a little funny going on with the sculpt on the front of the bardiche. It seems a little soft on what should be fairly defined edges, so it's producing uneven color rather than faux highlighting. Still, once that's dry, the entire model now has color, and by starting with a smooth satin white and applying the Express colors heavily, I've been able to get some nice faux highlighting and shading across the model. I could just finish the basing and call this battle ready, as GW puts it, but if I'm willing to put in just a little more effort, I can substantially improve this. So now it's time to go back and work on each color further. If I were painting in sub-assemblies, this is now when I would glue everything together before proceeding, but since this is the whole model, I can jump straight into highlighting. Starting with the yellow, I use Vallejo Model Color Ice Yellow thinned with Vallejo Glaze Medium and use this to pick out the most prominent upward-facing edges. There are 3 important points here. First, thinning with glaze medium dramatically extends the drying time without making it watery, which makes it easier to apply and less prone to drying on the brush. Second, because the Express paints did a good job of defining edges, I don't need to pick out every edge here, just the ones I specifically want to accentuate. Third, to that end, I'm focusing on just the upward facing edges, in part because that's how light naturally falls, and in part because those are the highlights that will actually be visible when looking down at the model on the tabletop. And lastly, you may notice that I've switched from the prior crappy $1 synthetic brush to a proper Kolinsky sable, in this case a Raphael A404 size 1, because having a fine tip will help a lot with precise highlighting. For the black, I use VMC Neutral Gray, again diluted with glaze medium. Because black is defined by its highlights more than its shading, I'll be a little more liberal here, picking out any really prominent upward facing folds. But again, the Express has done most of the work for me, so I'm essentially just reinforcing it where needed. I like to save the metallic highlights for last, so I'll go to the leather next and use VMC Cork Brown. This is a much lighter color than the Willow bark, but it's also very transparent pigment, so it tends to just slightly lighten the color under it, which is handy since the brown varies in tone a bit due to its one coat application. Once again, I'm not picking out every edge, only the ones I want to accentuate. The wood is very similar in that the color I'm using, VMC Ivory, is an off-white that if applied at full strength looks very stark. With the glaze medium though, I can apply thin layers and repeat as necessary to build up an appropriate color. Here I'm following the raised edges on the body of the Varnish, sheathed knife, and arquebus stock, but I don't feel a need to pick out all the wood grain on the arquebus, so I'll let the Express handle that. If I do accidentally go too light at any point here, it's not a problem to just come back with the bag of bones and apply a bit of that to tone it back down. It's all very freeform here, and there are a few mistakes that can't be corrected one way or another. Alright, now I'll do the metallics. I use chrome again to pick out all the upper edges of the metal. Metallics need stark highlights to look bright and shiny, so I am fairly liberal at this step. That makes it the most involved set of highlights, which is why I save it for second to last. Nothing much further to say here, and when I get to the brass, I use a 1-to-1 mix of gold and chrome. The actual last step is to finish the face, and for this I'll use Reaper Golden Highlight. This is from Reaper's Golden Skin Triad, and as the name implies, it's a fairly yellowish tan tone. I think the tonal variation from the reddish shading of the dwarf flesh combined with the yellowish golden highlight gives the skin some real liveliness without any real effort. I accentuate that further by applying a bit of Army Painter red tone to the lower lip, and it's a subtle effect that shows up better on some sculpts than others, but I think the brain subconsciously notices when it's missing. Since the mouth is open, I'll also use a bit of VMC Ivory to pick out the teeth. And with nothing else to distract me, I'm left with the eyes. Frankly, for any sculpt where I can get away with it, I tend to skip this step, but on this sculpt the eyes are quite visible, and completing them will add a lot to the end result. So I have my white diluted with glaze medium and just a bit on the tip of my brush, and I'll very carefully draw in the eyes with a horizontal movement. If I mess up, that's fine, not going to clean it up just yet. Next, I do the same with black, this time drawing the pupils with a vertical movement so that it spans the entire eye from top to bottom and avoids the scared look you get with applying pupils as dots. Now I can fix any mistakes, which I do by reapplying white over any spillover from the pupil, followed by reapplying the dwarf skin, and then golden highlight as needed. Oh, and it's not relevant to this model, but for cloth, rope, feathers, and other off-white textures, I usually just do one coat of mummy white and then highlight with pure white. Piece of cake. Now I could stop here, and if I were painting a model that I wanted to look clean and tidy, I would not do this next step. But I don't mind this model coming out looking a bit dirty, so I'm going to finish with an all-over wash, very similar to the one in my Tyranid tutorial. This is equal parts Army Painter Dark Tone, Strong Tone, Wash Medium, and Water, and it makes for a dark off-black that will strengthen the shading, black line recesses, and blend the highlights and the midtones a bit. I'm slopping this all over the model, then I'll carefully observe it and wick away excess as it pools. This will take a while because the wash will continue to flow and pool until it's well into drying, and if left unattended, it will form ugly blobs. Don't try to use heat or airflow to accelerate the process either, as it can then crack. Usually I'm batch painting, so it's not a big deal to wash a model, then go back and check on the previous one, then wash another model, then check on the previous two, and so on until they start to fully dry. You can see how the black-brown buildup in the recesses has toned down the orange of the uniform, and it's also added some strong shading to all the lighter colors, so now I can complete the basing and finish the model. I should mention that the basing itself was done by first smearing PVA glue around the entire base, and then dipping it in my lifetime supply of a mix of sand grits and woodland scenics ballast. Tap off the excess, remove any that got on the rim, job's done, prime with the rest of the model. Anyways, to paint it, I start with VMC German Camo Medium Brown, apparently now just labeled Medium Brown. I've thinned it out a fair bit so it won't cover in one pass, but I'll slop that all over the base and then run it along the base rim as well. After a second and slightly thicker coat over the sand, I have pretty good coverage, so now I'll switch to stone gray and heavily dry brush the sand with a 90% trashed sable brush that I reserve for this purpose. Once that's done, I'll wash all the sand with Army Painter Strong Tone, and when that's dry, I can build up a solid coat of medium brown for the base rim. The only things left are grass and varnishing, so I'll get out my tufts. I'm using Silflor Buffalo Grass tufts, specifically the late summer and autumn variants, and I'm dipping them in PVA that's been diluted with a little bit of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish. The varnish in the mix will help the glue to dry matte and not shiny gloss, just so that if I can't get all the way under the grass with my final varnish, it'll still be matte underneath. I'll give that plenty of time to dry, and then it's on to varnishing. Okay, so in prior videos, I've used Pledge Floor Gloss for a thick, extremely durable, but obnoxiously shiny protective layer, and then AK Interactive Ultra Matte to dull it down. That looked good, but over the course of years, I noticed my models gradually becoming glossy. It's still not clear to me exactly what determines whether it happens or how quickly, but it seems to be related to putting the Ultra Matte over a glossy surface, so I've revised my process accordingly. No gloss now, I'm instead just airbrushing a 3-to-1 mix of AK Interactive Ultra Matte to regular matte. The regular matte thickens the mixture and gives it just a hint of sheen that helps preserve the vibrancy of the colors, and after doing the whole squad on a turntable, I go model by model to make sure they're fully covered. As with the initial pre-painting varnish, I spray until the surface is visibly wet, then leave it to dry. And here is the final result, a whole squad of angry-looking grenadiers. There are some minor tonal and process variants as I was experimenting and iterating as I went, but on the whole I think they make for a cohesive group, and each model took no more than 2 hours from start to finish, despite the complexity of their sculpts. If you found this video useful and would like to see more, let me know down in the comments. I frankly have no idea what the demand is for this sort of content, or if Contrast Plus is just done to death already. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.